The Chinese have an old saying, "When the old man lost his horse, it turned out to be a blessing." Few stories embody this more than that of Francis I of France, a king who lost to Charles V in the race for the Holy Roman Emperor's crown, was about to lose to him again in Italy, and ultimately chose to fight a different kind of war. By 1521, he was still on his throne, but surrounded by setbacks. He had lost the crown he coveted, his armies were retreating in Italy, and Charles V, his greatest rival, now ruled an empire that nearly encircled France. By the end of the 1520s, Europe's balance of power rested on three shoulders. Charles V, the emperor who ruled half the known world, but found himself burdened by its contradictions. He dreamed of Catholic unity, but faced endless war. Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir, would soon break with Rome in the 1530s, remaking England in his own image. And Francis I, the king who lost a crown, a war, and his freedom, but returned to build a nation through art, language, and law. Each had power, each had vision, but their paths diverged, and in that divergence, the modern world began. It is tempting to rank them by victory, but history is not a scoreboard. What Francis lacked in military triumphs, he made up for in legacy. His reforms outlived his rivals' victories. In 1519, Emperor Maximilian died, leaving the throne of the Holy Roman Empire vacant. It was an imperial crown, but also a symbol of dominance in Europe, a title that could shape the balance of power for decades to come. Francis I saw an opportunity. He had youth, charisma, and the wealth of France behind him. He launched a diplomatic offensive, pouring gold into the courts of the prince-electors, flattering egos, sending emissaries. His aim was clear: to win the crown and rise above the patchwork of European rivals. Why could Francis even be a candidate for the Holy Roman Emperor's crown if France had never been part of it? Because the imperial title wasn't hereditary. It was elective. Any Catholic monarch could, in theory, win the support of the prince-electors, and Francis, though an outsider to the imperial lands, believed he had the charm, the wealth, and the vision to claim it. But his main competitor, Charles of Habsburg, already had a head start. As King of Spain, ruler of the Low Countries, and heir to the Habsburg lands, Charles was not just well-connected, he was everywhere. And he had something else: more money. With the backing of the Fuggers, a powerful German banking family, Charles outbid Francis. On July 28, 1519, he was elected emperor. It wasn't just a political defeat, it was personal. Francis believed the crown should have been his. The fact that it went to a rival so young and so encircling left a deep scar. Charles now ruled to the north, south, and east of France. Francis was surrounded and humiliated. From that point forward, Charles wasn't just a rival. He became an obsession. Francis would spend much of his reign trying to break free from the shadow of the emperor he had failed to become. In losing that prize, Francis began to define himself, not just through ambition, but through the envy he felt, the frustration he carried, and the resolve he refused to abandon. With the crown lost, Francis turned to war. He would challenge Charles not in courts, but on battlefields. In 1521, hostilities resumed in Italy. Francis aimed to reclaim the Duchy of Milan, a territory long contested between France and the Habsburgs. The French crown had once held sway there, and regaining it was both a strategic necessity and a matter of personal and dynastic pride. He dispatched his forces under the command of Odet de Foix, a nobleman with limited support and growing challenges. Francis had hoped to form a broader anti-Habsburg alliance, reaching out to Venice and other northern Italian states. But diplomatic efforts faltered. Many Italian powers hesitated to openly oppose Charles, whose influence was rising quickly across Europe. Meanwhile, Charles formed a powerful alliance with Pope Leo X. The Pope, a Medici, feared both French dominance in Italy and Francis's reformist sympathies. Their pact brought together imperial might and papal legitimacy, a daunting combination. For Francis, the war was no longer just a territorial contest. It was a holy and political coalition arrayed against him. Compounding the problem was money. France's fiscal system, still heavily reliant on feudal dues and indirect taxes, struggled to keep up with rising wartime expenses. The Estates General resisted heavier taxation. The French nobility was reluctant to support overseas expeditions that didn't benefit their own fiefs. Charles, on the other hand, had deeper pockets. Spain's New World riches flowed into his treasuries. More critically, he had the unwavering support of the Fugger banking dynasty. The Fuggers didn't just fund his imperial bid, they financed his military too. To repay these debts, Charles went so far as to sell imperial titles and offices, a controversial but effective way of generating immediate cash. The French commander, Lautrec, struggled against superior coordination and funding. By the end of the year, the French were in retreat. The Battle of Bicocca in 1522 would confirm their defeat, forcing them out of Milan entirely. This disparity turned strategy into desperation. Francis resorted to personal involvement. If generals could not secure victory, then the king himself would lead. That decision would prove costly. Then came the disaster at Pavia. In 1525, Francis personally led a campaign to retake Milan. It ended in catastrophe. At the Battle of Pavia, his forces were crushed by imperial troops. Francis himself was captured. In chains, he was marched to Madrid, where he would remain a prisoner for over a year. Forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Madrid in 1526, he surrendered Burgundy, Naples, and Flanders, even pledging to marry Charles's sister. To his mother he wrote, "All is lost, save honor." His freedom came at a cruel price, the exchange of his own sons as hostages. Once released, Francis declared the treaty null and void, arguing it had been signed under duress. Still, something had changed. Francis had seen the limits of military power. He had faced the full might of the empire and been broken by it. And he had come home not as a conquering king, but as a man who had to rebuild himself. His captivity had ripple effects beyond politics. For a Renaissance king steeped in ideals of glory, to be reduced to a prisoner was a spiritual crisis. And yet, this is precisely the moment when his transformation began. Francis had always admired the pen, long before he wielded the sword. He had a taste for art, letters, and spectacle. In 1516, he invited Leonardo da Vinci to his court, where the aging genius spent his final years under royal patronage. Leonardo brought with him not only sketches and inventions, but a certain mystique, and most famously, the Mona Lisa. Upon his death in 1519, the painting remained in France, a symbol of Renaissance prestige that Francis embraced. In the wake of his captivity, that appreciation hardened into policy. If he couldn't beat Charles with armies, he would outshine him with culture. Francis began transforming Fontainebleau from a medieval hunting lodge into a Renaissance palace. He invited Italian architects and artists to decorate it, blending French elegance with Italian brilliance. It wasn't just decoration, it was diplomacy by design, a cultural declaration of France's place at the center of European sophistication. In 1530, he founded the Collège de France, a new kind of institution free from papal control, open to humanist learning in Greek, Hebrew, and modern languages. Unlike the Sorbonne, it emphasized knowledge over orthodoxy. It was a direct assertion of royal patronage over intellectual life, an ideological challenge to both Charles and Rome. This cultural offensive was not a retreat. It was a redefinition of power. Francis could not command Europe with legions, but he could inspire it with ideas. If Charles ruled the map, Francis aimed to rule the imagination. Culture alone wasn't enough. Francis wanted to forge France into a centralized, modern state. In 1516, he signed the Concordat of Bologna, giving him the right to appoint French bishops, and thus bringing the national church under royal control. In 1539, he issued the Edict of Villers-Cotterêts, requiring all legal documents to be written in French rather than Latin. This was not just about clarity, it was about identity. The language of law would now reflect the language of the people. He reformed taxation, expanded the royal bureaucracy, and curtailed noble power. France, once a feudal patchwork, began to resemble a state. He may have failed to become emperor of the old empire, but he was becoming the architect of something new. Francis's legal reforms also created a deeper bond between monarch and subject. By standardizing the language of governance, he gave the French people a common civic vocabulary. It was not just nation-building, it was nation-defining. He never became emperor. He never conquered Italy. He never silenced dissent. But he gave France something else, a soul.